Hey folks, Professor Finn here, and today we're going to be looking at the next chapter in Ralph Klicker's Funeral Service Psychology and Counseling, and we're going to be discussing theories of grief. So let's go ahead and dive in. All right, theories of grief. So, first up, some important definitions. A grief syndrome is a set of symptoms associated with loss, and grief work is a process occurring with loss aimed at loosening the attachment to the dead for reinvesting in the living. So we need a basic understanding of why a loss from death causes different responses. And in 1969, John Bowlby pioneered a work on attachment and loss called theory of attachment. This creates, John Bowlby describes attachment behavior as any behavior people develop and maintain that enables them to be close to another individual. So, definition of attachment behavior: any behavior people develop and maintain that enables them to be close to another individual. When one person in this relationship dies, the other will display signs of protest, such as weeping, anger, sadness, and eventually move on to a gradual acceptance of the loss. Anyone who has ever lost a pet understands this, that immediate moment when the pet dies, the days or weeks following that is extremely hard. But as time progresses, we move on to a gradual acceptance of the loss. So, Bowlby's theory of attachment: humans have an instinctive need to form strong attachments to others. Attachments come from a need for security and safety. Situations that endanger the bond of attachment give rise to emotional reactions, and the greater the potential loss, the more intense the reaction. Next, we have Dr. Eric Lindemann. So he studied survivors in 1943 from a nightclub fire, and that nightclub was called the Coconut Grove. This happened in Boston, Massachusetts. Now, if you go on YouTube and you type in Coconut Grove fire, you will find a wealth of videos about how this disaster occurred. So, coping with grief is an experience that is physically, emotionally, and psychologically draining. And he wrote a paper called Symptomatology and Management of Acute Grief. So Dr. Lindemann suggested that many of the symptoms of grief were physical, and he found somatic distress in people involved in this disaster, such as tightness in the throat, choking, shortness of breath, need for sighing, empty feeling in the abdomen, and a lack of muscular power. So with his grief syndrome, he said, hey, there's got to be somatic or bodily distress. Your body has to be physically reacting to it. You have a preoccupation with the image of the deceased. So these are all the symptoms that forms into this grief syndrome. There was guilt relating to the deceased and the circumstances of the death. If only I had let them go out that night. If only I had gone with them, maybe things would have been different. Hostile reactions and the inability to function as they had before the death. And he coined the phrase grief work, which was an emancipation, a freeing from the bondage to the deceased. Because remember, they're preoccupied with what has happened and the person who died. So through grief work, they can free themselves from that preoccupation. They can readjust to the environment in which now the deceased is missing, and now they can form new relationships. Grief work progresses through a number of steps: a change in one's self-concept, a change in goals and aspirations, and a change in relationships to the outside world. So we first had Bowlby that said, hey, this is how we form attachments to people and what happens when attachments are threatened. Then Coconut Grove happens, and Lindemann says, wow, when people are grieving, they seem to have this group of characteristics that they all suffer from. And next, we have Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who wrote something called The Stages of Dying. It is generally accepted, even by Kubler-Ross, that you do not go through the stages in order. Now, this is to the long taught acronym DABDA, D-A-B-D-A, DABDA. So there are 5 stages in Kübler-Ross's theory: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. DABDA. So how did she come up with this? Well, she interviewed 200 dying people. And it was important for healthcare workers and families to be observant of where this person that was dying was at. Now, originally, people assumed it went from denial to anger to bargaining to depression, and that's the way it had to happen. So if you were at depression, hey, you've gotten past the denial and the anger, and good for you. What we found is that's not the case. People bounce back and forth between the stages. So what stage they're in determines what needs they have. And you as a caregiver, you as a health worker, need to be able to effectively identify what stage they are in so that you can provide the care that they need. And the encouragement is not to lose hope or become resigned to dying. Reassured patients' feeling of hope that everything medically and humanly possible is being done to help. Give them some satisfaction of peace. So first up is denial, a defense mechanism by which a person is unable or refuses to see things as they are because facts are threatening to the self. Overwhelming sense of unreality. Time when the mind is trying to comprehend the event but is unable to accept the full impact. And an example of a statement that people make at this time is, "This can't be happening to me. I don't believe this is happening. This isn't real. I must be dreaming." That is all examples of someone being in denial. Anger, blame directed at another person. Why me? Why not someone bad? Why not a murderer? Why not this? Why not that? Why does it have to be me? I live a good life. I do good things for people, etc. Bargaining, attempting to make deals to stop or change the diagnosis by begging, wishing, praying not to die, or at least death. Depression, overwhelming feelings of hopelessness, frustration, bitterness, self-pity, mourning, the impending loss of hopes, dreams, and plans for the future. A person feels a lack of control or numbness. And acceptance, knowing the impending death is real, not liking it, but realizing you got to keep on trucking. We now get into just about the 80s, and we encounter William Worden. And Worden gives us 4 tasks of mourning. So think about this. We've defined what an attachment is. We've now encountered, hey, here are the things that when people are grieving that they all kind of show in common. Here are some stages that people go through while they're getting towards death. And now Worden comes along and says, hey, so that's nice and dandy, but how do we get you through this? And so Worden gives us 4 tasks of mourning. So now that a death has occurred, how do you process it? How do you get through it? Finally, quote unquote, something practical, okay? So first, accept the reality of loss. Even if death is expected, there is always a sense that it never happened. Ranges from a normal short-term slight distortion to just abnormal delusion. So accept the reality of loss. The best way to accept the reality of loss is see the dead body. Experience the pain of grief and express emotions associated with it. So now that you've crossed that first speed bump, you have to work through the grief. You have to experience your grief, and you have to express the emotions. Pain can be emotional and or physical. So now this is building off of Dr. Lindemann. If pain is not honestly experienced and associated feelings expressed, it can last a lifetime. If you don't get past the first stage, you can't make it to this because you've never accepted the reality of loss, so you can never really experience grief. Now we're in an order. Once you're experiencing the grief and you're expressing the emotions, then you can move on to the next step. To adjust to the environment in which the deceased is missing. Because if you haven't experienced the grief, you haven't expressed the emotions, it's impossible for you to adjust because you're never going to make it to this point. Each person plays a number of roles in others' lives. One must adjust to doing without all the person was and did. One may have to do things that they have never done. And one must also deal with the loneliness accompanying the loss. A homemaker whose husband dies that was a breadwinner might have to learn to work or learn how to manage investments. A person who was a breadwinner who loses their spouse may have to begin making their own meals, taking care of the home in addition to some of those things. That doesn't seem like a lot. But when you have people that have been married or partners together for 30, 40, 50 years and they've had their separation of duties, that can be an issue. That can be debilitating when coupled with everything else. And finally, withdraw the emotional energy and reinvest it in another relationship. And it may be difficult because often the bereaved tries to hold on to the past attachment. Fear of letting go and frightened of forgetting the deceased or investing in another relationship that may also end and cause more pain. Then, here comes Freud. This is precursor to everybody. So Freud, he theorized that a major task of grieving is to withdraw the libido, which is the energy of love and pleasure that was invested in the deceased. This causes symptoms such as dejection, loss of interest in the outside world, loss of capacity to love, and self-reproach. Now, he's not exactly wrong, right? Mourning is the work of letting go of these libidinal bonds. So even prior to all of this, Freud was kind of on the right track. He's like, well, there has to be some type of attachments, and that attachment in this case is the libido. And as long as you have those attachments, bad things are going to happen. So you have to separate that libido from the person it's attached to and give it to someone else. And then we have Bowlby and Lindemann picking it up. And then from then we've had Warden, Kubler-Ross, etc., now Wolfeld, Sanders, and others. Folks, that concludes this lecture. We'll see you next video.